Okay, so let's talk about this Pluck, which is probably, or definitely is, the main kind of driving melodic theme of the track. So for this sound, we're going to go back to an earlier project and I'll walk you through exactly how I made this sound as far as the sound design and processing goes, and my thought process when programming it as well. So let's go back to an earlier project and I'll show you how I made it. Okay, let's walk through the Pluck. Here is a little preview. All right, so I made this sound in Native Instruments Monarch. So let's have a look at the synth first. Pretty simple sound here. So I used 3 oscillators for this. The first one is a square wave, as you can hear there. The second oscillator is a saw, but up 1 octave. The third oscillator is another saw, but tuned up a 5th from the second oscillator. I mixed in a little bit of noise to thicken the sound out a little bit and add just kind of like an old school, dirty, dusty feel. Gave it a little touch of feedback and pushed up the load a little bit just to give the sound a little bit more body and attitude. As far as the filter envelope and amp envelope, pretty simple Pluck type settings here. Short attack, fairly short decay. I'm using a fair bit of resonance as well. And then I am giving it a little bit of modulation here with the mod wheel here. And that's being controlled with a subtle LFO. You can see this moving around a little bit. So that's the sound design within Monarch. There is a fair amount of processing on this Pluck sound, so let's have a look at that. The first in the chain is this Omega N. I love this little saturation plugin. It just warms the sound up without it and with it. Then we have the Native Instruments driver plugin, just to beef the sound up even a little bit more. All I did to change the preset or default setting on this plugin is kick up the resonance a little bit, and that's just enough to give it a nice little boost. So without it and with. Okay, and then we have the Harrison EQ, which is essentially just bracketing the sound in, rolling off the lows that I don't need, taking a little bit off the top end, so I'm not interfering too much with the hats when it opens all the way up as far as the filter goes. Then I have a couple plugins just to kind of add a little touch of modulation, thicken things out a little bit. So we have this UAD delay modulation plugin. I usually use this for stereo delays, but in this case, I'm using this nice double preset, which is just thickening the sound out. Pretty subtle, mixed quite low, 10%. And then we have a little phasing going on, just to give it a little movement. This is mixed quite low, and I'm automating the mix of this plugin throughout the arrangement. And then we have some auto panning, again mixed quite low. I'm probably automating the mix here too, but I can't remember. And that's set to a quarter dotted cycle rate. And then we have a little bit of side chaining. And then this is the LFO I mentioned, that's just giving a subtle bit of movement to the modulation wheel on Monarch. Now I have a couple auxiliary tracks set up for this sound, so let's have a look at those. The first one, let's just look at the reverb first. So I think this is just the default setting here on Valhalla Room, and that's followed with a bandpass EQ just to keep things tidy. But but you can see that there's some movement here with the actual send amount. So I've done that with a couple of these auxiliary tracks, and it's just I feel like it just makes it a little bit more expressive. So that's what this LFO is here. It's just a random LFO set to control, give a little bit of movement to the send amount. On simple repeating rhythms like this is something I like to do on occasion. Use random LFOs to inject a little bit of movement, unpredictability, and just make it feel a little bit more alive and interesting throughout the entirety of a track. Okay, so that's the reverb. I have it sent over to this delay as well. So I'm using the H delay, 8th dotted. I usually like to add a little reverb to my delay sends. I find it just helps it settle into the mix. It pushes it back a little bit as well in the mix, and just gives it its own kind of unique space. Instead of using a standard delay, in this case I used the space modulator, and it's one of these, there's a few of these lush reverb presets, which has kind of like some subtle chorusing and delay and bits of modulation in there. And in certain circumstances, I think it's a little bit more interesting than just a standard delay. So I thought it worked in this case. So it's mixed, kind of low, but it's just giving these delays a little extra space and movement. And then I'm distorting the reverbs and delays slightly with the defacer plugin, which I mentioned or showed you earlier. And then we have some auto panning here with the pancake from Cable Guys. Super simple. Move that around a little bit. Bandpass EQ to confine this into a specific frequency band, keep things tidy. And then I'm compressing all this a little bit with the 1176. And also I really like the color that this plugin gives. And then lastly, we have some sidechaining here. It's the same curve, sidechain curve, that I'm using on the sound itself, but just mixed a little bit more aggressively. Okay, there's a couple more auxiliary tracks here. So the first one is this chorus, which is panned over to the left. And I'm using the Brigade chorus from UAD. And then again, you can see that there's a little movement with the send amount. So I'm just doing the same exact thing that I did with the reverb, just adding a random LFO set to a small range to fluctuate the send amount. And all these random LFOs are moving at different rates too. So to kind of counterbalance the chorus, I set up another auxiliary track panned over to the right. And this one has like a tremolo effect, moving at an eighth note. And then I use the little alter boy to pitch this up 5 semitones, but it's only mixed in around 20% or so with a little bit of drive, and then a very small frequency band. We're confining this to, again, to keep things tidy, and so we're not just blurring everything else in the mix, and then a little touch of reverb on this as well. And I added the chorus and this tremolo aux tracks kind of as an afterthought. I just felt like I wanted to, spread out the sound a little bit more across the frequency spectrum. So that's why I added these panned auxiliary tracks. But you can hear the sound. Let's hear it without any of the processing. I mean, if I take off the auxiliary tracks, it sounds super bland and boring. Yeah. And let's... So, okay, as far as the actual pattern goes, there's a couple different variations. So we have this one here. And that just kind of works as a little turnaround. And then we have this big change up right here that happens in, you know, 2 sections of the track. So when I was, you know, making the sound and programming it and trying to figure out how I wanted to use it in the arrangement, I wasn't sure if this would work to have that big of a change up with the pattern. But I think it turned out quite nice. You know, you have this repeating rhythm that's playing for quite some time before you get any sort of change up. And then when it finally happens, I think it creates a nice moment where it switches from a simple 1-bar pattern to, you know, a nice question and answer 2-bar phrase. So. And that's probably my favorite moment in the track, when it switches from that simple rhythm to the, you know, 2-bar question and answer alternative. And there's one thing I wanted to show you within the piano roll here. So let's have a quick look at that. Yeah, it's this one here. So on this little phrase here, you can see that I detuned this D note, and it's detuned 80 cents. So it's essentially playing more of a D sharp than it is a D. And D sharp is not present in the scale of this track. This track is in B minor. But when I was playing around with the notes and this phrase, I just thought the D sharp sounded better. So I was just going to play the D sharp, but I ended up just detuning it heavily, so so you're getting more of the D sharp. And my point is to not be afraid to experiment with incidental notes that are outside of the scale that you're working in. Sometimes they can really add to, you know, your sound. So in this case, I thought it worked quite nice. So I just wanted to mention that, you know, if it sounds good, it is good. In this case, I thought it worked quite nice. But other than that, I mean, it's just, yeah, simple little phrase there. And as you can see, there's a fair bit of automation happening throughout the track. Filters opening up, mix of the phase plugin, yeah, reverb, delay sends, what have you. Okay, so one more thing I wanted to mention about the Pluck, and that's this little Pluck layer here. So let's listen to that. And this is just, you know, mixed quite low underneath the main Pluck, but it's pitched differently. It's got some different delays happening. It's heavily band passed as well, and it's just meant to, you know, be an interesting layer to the Pluck and add an extra layer of depth there. And I think they work nicely together. And you really miss it when you take it away. also gave it, you know, a different ambient treatment as well to kind of put it in its own little unique space and just have it, you know, complement the main Pluck and just add that extra layer of interest. And yep, that's what that's there for. You can see a little bit of volume automation happening. Let's move on. Okay.